Good morning to those of you joining on YouTube and on the broadcast. If you'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into the system, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to WITA's unofficial kickoff to fall. Of course, everyone knows you don't introduce new products before Labor Day, but we feel like today's events are unofficial kickoff to our fall programming, and we're delighted you can join us here today, even though it is about 90 degrees with about equivalent humidity in DC today. Before we get into today's event, we want to highlight several events we have coming up in the next few weeks. Next Wednesday, September 9th, we're hosting Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy of Florida for a discussion of trade and national security. And on Thursday, September 10th, I'd say that's our formal kickoff to our fall programming with a very special event with Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, and Bob Zoellick, the former US Trade Representative and President of the World Bank. We also hope that you or your colleagues can join us for our intensive trade seminar, which takes place over 3 days, September 18, 21, and 22. We have a fantastic roster of speakers lined up to talk about how the US trade policy apparatus functions and some of the key issues facing trade policymakers. Information on those events, including an interview with the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee Chair Earl Blumenauer and the launch of our Trade and the Environment series, can be found on our website, www.wita.org. For today's event, we like to highlight some of the people you're in community with who are watching today's event on Zoom. So Leslie Alexander with the Tennessee International Trade Center, Bill Frymoyer with the Motor and Equipment Manufacturers, James Rowland with the Ford Motor Company, and Kathleen Black with the Coca-Cola Company. Thank you, Leslie, Bill, James, and Kathleen for joining us today. If you're watching this on Zoom, you have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A tab. We'll try to get to questions after the discussion amongst our panelists. Today, we're pleased to be joined by my old and dear friend, Deanna Oken, the former chair of the International Trade Commission. Deanna and I go way back. We worked together on the Hill. She was working for Senator Murkowski. I was working for Senator Rockefeller. We actually met staffing our bosses on the US-Japan Friendship Commission, which I think hopefully still exists. It did some really good work back in those times. It's great to see you, Deanna. Thank you for moderating today's session. I won't get into detail of our panelists' biographies since you have them in your program, but I want to say how pleased we are to have them all here today. Robert DeFrancisco of Wiley Ryan is here representing Century Aluminum. Jean Simard is President and CEO of the Aluminum Association of Canada. And Tom Dobbins is the President and CEO of the Aluminum Association US. Thanks so much to Robert, John, and Tom for joining us this morning to discuss this issue that has gotten so much attention in recent weeks. We're very grateful to all of you for making the time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Deanna.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to everyone for joining the WITA webinar today. It's a pleasure to be part of it, and it's another timely event from WITA during this time when we've done everything virtual. I've had the opportunity to participate in many of these and to listen to them. So again, today we're here to talk about aluminum imports and tariffs, and we have a great group, as you can see from the panelists, so I won't spend much time before turning it over to them. But I know that the WITA audience is always diverse. We have many of you who might just be tuning in to see what this dispute is about. Some might be following it closely. Some might be wondering, what does this mean for USMCA disputes in the future, and may not be familiar with the industry itself. So I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to give an overview, and then I'll turn to our panelists, but we do hope that you will have questions for us. So we'll all keep our presentations short and then look to the audience to engage on questions. And so with that, let me attempt to see if we can get to the right part here. Sorry.
This is Ken's jumping in. We're just gonna, Diego needs to just let you share screen. So we're gonna try to do that. Just be patient with us. You should be able to hit share screen, Deanna.
Okay, do you see it?
Not yet. I'm just back here for a second while we try to work out the technology. Thank you all for being patient. Do you share a screen on the bottom of your computer, Deanna?
Yes, I hit it, but it's
And then it should give you which screen to pull up. There you go. I think it's now, you have started screen sharing. Now you can pull up the right screen for us. There we go.
Got it. All right. Thank you. Apologize for the slight interruption there. So again, just really briefly here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about aluminum tariffs and the Section 232 tariffs. Give you some statistics on unwrought aluminum imports. We'll just take a look at the side letter since that is what's implicated here. And so just looking just at a timeline, again, to set the stage here, going back to 2017, of course, we have the renegotiation of NAFTA that began. In May of 2018 is when the administration, the Trump administration, imposed 10% tariffs on several aluminum products. Canada, in response, imposed $16.6 billion in retaliatory tariffs. In October, there was the agreement to replace NAFTA with USMCA. And then in May, so essentially a year after the imposition of the Section 232 tariffs, Canada and the US reached an agreement that ends the levy on Canadian aluminum. We go to July of 2020 when, of course, a very significant event where USMCA takes effect. And then we get to August 6, 2020, when the US announces a plan to reimpose the 10% tariff on Canadian unwrought aluminum, so a smaller subsection than the 232 tariffs. The next day, Canada announces $3.6 billion in retaliatory tariffs. And on August 16th, the tariff went into effect. And so here we are at the beginning of September and talking about what's next. Just briefly looking at imports, this is a chart showing all the imports that were subject to the Section 232 tariffs. The yellow line is unwrought aluminum, so the much larger one, even when the 232 was imposed. Again, just looking at it at a bar chart, and I tried to give everyone a 5-year window to talk about this. And of course, I know the panelists will want to put this in perspective, but just the shaded part of the graph shows the period of time in which the Section 232 tariffs were in place. And then just to familiarize those who may not be familiar with it, this is the side letter that was signed in November 2018 regarding Section 232 between the parties. So the language, I'm not going to read through it, but you can see it there saying that the US should not adopt or maintain a measure imposing tariffs or import restrictions on goods or services of Canada under Section 232 for at least 60 days after imposition of a measure, and that there would be, during the 60-day period, the country should seek to negotiate an outcome based on industry dynamics and historical trading patterns. And obviously that's what we want to hear our panelists talk about today. And again, I just took some quotes from, there's obviously two sides to the story, and then that's why we're having this panel today. Robert DeFrancisco represents Century Aluminum. I've got a quote up there from Century Aluminum, as well as Magnitude 7 Metals. And then on the other side, including the Aluminum Association represented here today, U.S. Chamber and Alcoa opposed to the imposition. And just again, I think we have a diverse audience, and I know many of you are users, and hopefully we'll hear from you as well. But I just thought it was interesting to look at the industries that were affected by the aluminum tariffs, and to think about this in the context of USMCA and impacts on supply chains. And I hope we will get into some questions about that as well. And then just finally, just to be clear that while we're going to be focused on unwrought aluminum, the 76.01 HTS category, there are many other aluminum products that are important and are covered. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Robert to kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. And thank you to WITA for having me this morning. As Deanna mentioned, I'm counsel to Century Aluminum, but I'm also head of policy and counsel to the American Primary Aluminum Association. And we're grateful to be here today to share our views. I'd like to begin by discussing a recent op-ed by Michael Bless, who's Century CEO and APAA member. In the op-ed, Mr. Bless correctly points out that the pandemic has shown that the U.S. must maintain production in critical industries like primary aluminum. In a national crisis, the U.S. cannot be wholly dependent on foreign production, even from allies, for critical materials. For high purity aluminum in particular, the United States is the only available production capacity. But smelters can't survive on high purity aluminum alone. They must make standard grade aluminum in order to achieve the right economies of scale. And in this scenario, economic security is national security, and the primary aluminum industry in this country supports both national defense and critical infrastructure. This is not controversial. This has actually been the view of the last two administrations. In fact, you need to look no further than yesterday's Washington Post report on the Pentagon's analysis of China's efforts to expand its nuclear and missile forces. The Pentagon report notes that China's goal is to build a military that is equal to and in many ways superior to the United States military. So while our adversaries are securing key resources and expanding manufacturing to support a massive military buildup, the U.S. has seen its manufacturing capabilities steadily hollowed out. In order to meet these growing threats and future crises, the United States must have a sustainable and viable primary aluminum industry. Our allies are also economic competitors, and unfortunately, at times, certain economic policies pursued by an ally can have negative effects on critical U.S. industries. The aluminum excess capacity crisis is an example of that. The capacity crisis is a global problem driven by governmental interference and subsidization both inside and outside of China. The OECD aluminum report documents the significant adverse effects these subsidies have had on aluminum industries in Europe and the United States, where there are not significant subsidies provided. This global race to the bottom has allowed producers to exploit subsidies provided by various governments at the expense of U.S. production. Left unchecked, there would no longer be a primary aluminum industry left in the United States. And because primary aluminum is a globally traded commodity, the adverse effects of the excess capacity cannot be confined to a single country or actor. As such, relief must be broad, covering all import sources. In fact, the Aluminum Association recognized as much when it filed an 18-country trade remedy case after having received relief from Chinese imports a year earlier. Just like the downstream producers' request for broad, comprehensive relief, the primary end of the value chain needs the same broad, comprehensive relief. The relief provided by the Section 232 tariffs has allowed the U.S. primary industry to recover and put it on more sustainable footing. Once the tariffs were put into place, U.S. primary aluminum production increased by over 50% from 2017 to 2019. The recovery, unfortunately, was short-lived. Following the exclusion of Canada from the program, imports of unalloyed primary aluminum from Canada surged almost immediately. The period from June 2019 to July 2020 saw an average monthly Canadian import volume of unalloyed primary, specifically under HTS 760110, at substantially higher levels than the average monthly import volume over any other period before the tariffs were imposed. Ultimately, imports of unalloyed Canadian primary doubled over the previous 12 months, resulted in a 57% collapse in the Midwest premium, and cost 700 machinist union workers their jobs in Washington state. True allies respect agreements. The agreement between the U.S. and Canada to lift the aluminum tariffs and pass USMCA allowed for the reimposition of tariffs if a surge undermined the relief. A surge in unalloyed primary aluminum clearly occurred, the Midwest premium collapsed, and after consultations, the tariffs were reimposed. If no action was taken, the Midwest premium would have continued its slide, and other smelters would have been forced to shutter. Instead, the relief provided has returned the industry to sustainability, where the industry can now make the investments necessary to remain competitive into the future. Again, I'd like to thank you all for having us. I look forward to answering your questions after the panel is concluded.
Thanks, Robert. And now for a Canadian perspective, I'd like to turn to Jean.
Thank you for the privilege of addressing such a high-level group of trade policy experts through WITA. It certainly feels odd to be here today as a Canadian defending our aluminum exports into the USA and reminding everybody that our metal has never been, is not, and never will be a threat to the US national security. As to the question of surge, there hasn't been any, there is not, and there won't be. Our industry is simply responding to market changes without increasing its capacity. We have pivoted our production during COVID, as was the case in smelters all over the world, including in the US, in order to keep pot lines alive. Increases in certain product lines have been accompanied in decreases in others, resulting in a zero-sum game. Backed by nature, Canada's made visionary choices, including hydroelectric dams, our historical assets, long amortized and providing renewable, competitive, low-cost energy. The US, a largely densified and technologically advanced country with a highly skilled manufacturing sector, transformed metal into parts and final products destined to its domestic and export markets. We lack the critical mass, and you lack the low carbon and affordable energy. We have a match made in heaven, forming a seamless continental industrial value chain and military supply base. No wonder Canada was the first country to be made part of the US national technology and industrial base. Following a series of joint US-Canada commitments to share continental defense instead of defending ourselves against each other. Canada's aluminium provided 40% of all the aluminium for the Allies' war effort, making our country, in President Roosevelt's words, the aerodrome of democracy. Canada and its aluminium industry are an essential contributor to the arsenal of democracy. In the same perspective of national security, our two countries are looking into a potential joint strategy on critical materials, which makes sense given the way in which our respective territories are endowed with natural resources. One wonders then, how did we get to what brings us here today? Two factors come into play: a short-sighted and opportunistic interpretation of the joint statement of May 17, 2019, and more importantly, the systemic impacts of Chinese over-subsidized capacity, as reported by the LME, the recognized clearinghouse for non-Chinese prices. The joint statement of May 17 calls for actions by both the US and Canada, as well as Mexico, including effective measures to prevent imports of unfairly subsidized or dumped metal, transshipments of aluminium through consultation, and establishment of an agreed-upon process for monitoring aluminium between them. To this day, there is no agreed-upon process or monitoring system, even though both Canada and the Aluminium Association have called for it. But Canada has its import monitoring system in place since September 2019 and has announced the full implementation of traceability from smelter to border of Canadian smelted and poured aluminium. Canada is still to this day the only country having fulfilled its commitments and beyond. We're still waiting for Mexico to do anything about a monitoring system for imports of aluminium. As to the joint statement, it says what it is, a joint statement, frustratingly vague without a clear definition of what constitutes a surge. However, it seems to suggest that it must be meaningful and beyond historical volumes of trade. The COVID-driven market transition that happened in the spring and early summer here and around the world certainly does not qualify for this definition. As US imports of P1020 were up 9% in the first half of 2020 versus 2017, there was a corresponding drop of 28% in value-added product imports, representing an overall drop of 5% from imports of unwrought aluminium. We are below 2017 numbers, the last year before the tariffs and before the ABI lockout. There is certainly no surge situation coming from Canada. Unfortunately, forces at play, although unrepresentative of the great majority of the aluminium industry, have been able to leverage the tariff tool in order to artificially increase the cost of aluminium in North America. All in favor of foreign traders whose Swiss bank accounts must be surging by now, impacting North American consumers, small and medium businesses, and the automotive value chain in the midst of a pandemic. As announced, Canada will retaliate dollar for dollar across a spectrum of products in conformity with the joint statement provisions. This will impact competitiveness of businesses exporting goods into Canada and jeopardize their link to market. Unfortunately, this is all playing in the hands of China, which, as the New York Times reported on Monday, is taking over markets around the world, and Russian metal, represented by the same traders with controlling stakes in US smelters. Low commodity prices have been with us for more than 10 years, corresponding to the period of Chinese subsidies of aluminium and other industries, and the North American industry is running out of resilience, curtailing and shutting down production capacity in order to survive, including in Canada. More recently, between March 2018 and March 2020, the total price of aluminium in North America fell by $900 a metric ton, all rooted in the LME world price, with pain felt on both sides of the border. Even with growing demand and a metal deficit in the domestic North American market, low world prices make any expansion project unsustainable for anyone in the continent. With $13 billion investments over 15 years in plants modernization, we had to decrease our overall employment base to remain competitive. When you think of it, our preferred customer, the US, consumes yearly 6 million metric tons of metal while producing at best 1 million metric tons. From a macroeconomic standpoint, you would expect us to grow our share by increasing capacity. Far from it, we're today where we were 10 years ago with no expansion project in sight. The cost to build an expansion in Canada is 4 to 5 times the cost of its equivalent in China. And while our time to commissioning is 3 years, it's 14 months in China. Do the maths. My Chinese competition is 2 years ahead at 30% of the cost. China took only 11 years to produce more aluminum than the US manufactured in over 100 years. China's cumulative use of aluminum metal has exceeded 300 million metric tons over the last decade. And it's now harvest time for scrap metal. As scrap metal prices itself to be consumed, China grows its overwhelming share of the market by adding new capacity upstream and downstream, enabled by state subsidies of all forms. It progressively destroys existing privately owned competition while inhibiting market-driven expansion outside the country. This growth has come at a high price and with massive state aid, as reported in the OECD report, with the Chinese state pouring $63 billion over 5 years in subsidies of all sorts to 7 Chinese aluminum companies, with one company alone getting $35 billion in subsidies. We stand to be the next magnesium, where most of the world's capacity is now located in China. The result of a well-synchronized operation, unless we learn from the past and together work relentlessly at containing China's disruptive non-market economy behavior into the world's market economy. If there is only one of us left at the end, we all lose. The only way to resolve the China issue is for the other half of the world, the market-based economies, to engage into a robust, aligned, and sustained rejection of unfairly subsidized and dumped Chinese metal, if necessary, through the coordinated application of trade measures in the form of tariffs and quotas. We must also bring China to the table through international institutions such as the WTO or OECD and agree altogether on the way forward. Subsidized metal has no place in free and fair trade environments. Both the AEC and the Aluminium Association have been successful in getting other regions of the world to support this containment initiative. The future of our domestic North American industry and the health of our industrial value chain are affected by a situation beyond our borders, requiring exceptional means in order to effect the required changes. That's the real threat to US national security, the collapse of not just US aluminum production, but production outside China. We have a strong foundation to build and develop from the USMCA, a modern, stable trading mechanism. A lot remains to be done in terms of policymaking to materialize its full value. Self-serving corporate interests don't make for good policymaking. Our two countries certainly deserve better than being played against each other to the benefit of foreign adversaries that we should be competing together against. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. And Tom, to give another perspective, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you. And again, it is an honor to speak to this very distinguished group of trade policy experts. And you know, as Jean is saying, this is a watershed moment for trade policy in this country. Many of the issues confronting leaders here in the United States and around the world are the same issues also confronting leaders in our industry. Clearly, the Trump administration has appropriately shown a light on how devastating the outsourcing of a large segment of our manufacturing base to China has been on a significant segment of the US workforce. However, we've seen over the last several decades, fair trade can generate important benefits for our nation's economy, for our allies, and for the developing world. With 95% of the world's consumers located outside of the United States, it's vital that government policymakers focus on reducing barriers to U.S. companies sending their products overseas, while also ensuring that they are not forced to compete against subsidized and unfairly traded goods here in the United States. It's also important that U.S. trade policy seeks not only to open foreign markets to U.S. companies to sell their products to new customers abroad, but also works to maximize the competitiveness of our domestic companies. We've seen the Chinese make very aggressive moves to dominate industries by using large targeted government subsidies and other illegal trade activities. And COVID has been a stark reminder of just how important a reliable supply chain is to our economy. Again, all of these currents are reflected in the issue we're discussing today. There's also an opportunity to examine a bilateral approach to trade versus a multilateral approach. There's also an issue of industrial policy versus free market economics. We're here because the administration imposed tariffs on imports of Canadian unwrought or primary aluminum based on a determination that these imports pose a threat to our nation's security. It claimed there was a, quote, surge of primary aluminum into the US. In reality, US Census Bureau data show that overall imports of primary aluminum from Canada into the United States declined by about 2.6% from May to June, most current data that are available. Official Canadian export data for P1020, this again, same material, released as of 9 o'clock this morning, shows a 19% decline in imports in July. And Canadian and census data have been tracking very closely in recent months, so it's an accurate reflection. Total primary aluminum import volumes from Canada for the first 6 months of 2020 were nearly 5% lower than the same period in 2017, the last full year without Section 232 tariffs in place. And overall, imports of primary aluminum from Canada have barely budged as a percentage of total US primary aluminum imports in 30 years. The goal of the administration was to protect US smelters like Century. The Aluminum Association opposes these tariffs because our nation has long been dependent on imports of significant volumes of primary aluminum that allow the downstream portion of our industry to operate and compete with other competitors around the world. Even at full capacity, our smelters can only produce about 1/3 of the primary aluminum we need in the US. So we're going to have to import primary aluminum from somewhere, and the alternatives to Canada are Russia, the Middle East, and China. And I do not have to explain to this audience for geopolitical reasons why these are poor alternatives. COVID pandemic adds another important reason to have a reliable supply chain of primary aluminum. Further, in terms of the industry's impact on the US economy, fully 97% of the US aluminum industry jobs are in the mid to downstream production and processing. If these portions of the industry are to thrive, we need a reliable supply of primary aluminum. They do not need higher costs from tariffs for their raw material when the industry is already suffering. And maybe most importantly, the reimposition of tariffs on imports of primary aluminum from Canada is a distraction from the true source of the challenges confronting US smelters. Chinese government subsidies have resulted in massive overcapacity to produce primary aluminum in China. And I think all the panelists agree on this. Indeed, while the US government has been working through the process of levying tariffs on Canada, the Chinese have added 680,000 tons per year of new smelter capacity during the first 8 months of 2020, an amount that is equal to about 40% of total US aluminum smelting capacity. As long as the Chinese government continues to direct massive subsidies to their domestic producers, no prudent business person would invest in smelters in the United States. Indeed, as you heard, an OECD report released in January detailed that 5 companies in China were the largest recipients of government support from 2013 to 2017, having received nearly $60 billion in support from the government of China during that period. In addition, US smelters cannot get the long-term, low-cost electricity contracts they need to be solvent, much less profitable. This is why no US smelters have been built since 1979. Companies are not investing to modernize even their existing equipment. The industry saw the handwriting on the wall regarding energy pricing long ago and invested in smelting capacity in Canada with its abundant supply of hydropower, as Jean has explained. Unfortunately, the need for ensuring long-term supply of reasonably priced electricity to the US smelting industry is an issue that has gone unaddressed for many years. Instead of grappling with this and other issues confronting the industry, the administration decided to reimpose tariffs on a value trading partner with whom, along with Mexico, we just implemented a major trade deal that was intended to lift all of our economies because that is what free and fair trade does. Unfortunately, the biggest beneficiaries of the newest imposed tariffs will be metal traders, as Jean explained, and will make huge profits on arbitrage because the value of their holdings in the US just appreciated as a result of the tariff. So, and Jean explained that, so I'm going to skip that part. But again, if you go on to search engines, you will see a connection between metal traders and Russian imports of aluminum and some of the companies, the US companies that are making the most noise on this issue. So what have we learned through all of this? Clearly, a unilateral trade/industrial policy that ignores market realities does not work. It hurts the vibrant components of the economy in the name of protecting the less competitive. Secondly, that we need to focus on the root cause of problems. In this case, Chinese subsidies have resulted in massive overcapacity to produce primary aluminum in China, not the symptoms. The trade policy must balance the needs of downstream producers for supplies of imported primary aluminum to supplement significant shortfalls in domestic supply, along with the broader energy policy issues that make US smelters less profitable than many of their competitors. So where do we go from here? We need to forge trade policy going forward that does not seek to prop up individual companies without addressing larger issues such as Chinese industrial policy and US energy policy that are needed to ensure competitive smelter industry in the US. We need to, and secondly, disrupt our supply chain and make it less reliable, and not punish our allies and reward their geopolitical rivals and enrich foreign companies that advocate for trade policy that advances only their narrow self-interest. So instead of, we need a trade policy that takes a multilateral approach to containing Chinese subsidized aluminum and ultimately eliminating Chinese subsidies to its aluminum smelters. I would add that our unilateral approach has only meant that instead of subsidized aluminum coming in through the front door, is coming in from Mexico and other market economies that are seeing increased imports of semi-fabricated aluminum products from China, which Robert alluded to. This is why the Aluminum Association has advocated for a comprehensive import monitoring program, which the Canadians have in place. Further, the Section 232 exclusion process has incentivized US purchasers to pursue supplies from China. In the case of aluminum sheet for beverage cans, the volume of Section 232 exclusions granted in the first half of 2020 are 3 times greater than the volume of the can sheet consumed in the United States annually. US aluminum industry can meet the entire demand, and therefore there was no reason for these exclusions. We also need a trade policy that doesn't hamstring the most competitive elements of our economy by imposing retaliatory tariffs on our most important trading partners, especially market economies who are allies and are not a threat to our national security. Canada is in the process of identifying retaliatory tariffs that will diminish the US manufacturers that compete with Canadian manufacturers and provide those Canadian companies with an advantage. Unfortunately, Canada is not the only country with such retaliatory tariffs against us. Finally, we need a trade policy that holds strong supply chains with reliable trading partners like Canada. And it looks to growing manufacturing jobs where we are competitive, not protect a relatively small number of jobs where we are not. Obviously, we must continue to retrain workers, leave declining industries, and prepare them for jobs in growing industries. But history has shown us that industrial policy will never outwit markets. Fortunately, the European Commission, Brazil, the Gulf States Cooperation Council, Vietnam have joined the U.S. aluminum industry in filing anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases against China. We can grow that alliance to other market economies and bring China to the table, or we can go it alone in the aluminum industry. Will end up like rare earth minerals in the semiconductor industry. It will be based in China. Thank you. I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, that was perfect time because we have a bunch of questions that are starting to stack up here. So I want to give time for our audience to do that. And Ken, I don't know if you want to jump in here or if you want me to go ahead and take some of these questions, but I also thought I'd give Robert a chance to respond.
I think let's let Robert kind of kick us off. Let's let him jump in. I know he's probably could see. Looks like he's burning to say a few things. Let him,
I thought so. Go ahead, Robert.
Try to get to some of the questions as well.
Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Just first on the this discussion about whether there was surge or wasn't a surge, I think the data is very, very clear. There was a surge. We're looking at, and the administration looked at imports under 760110. That's unwrought, non-alloyed, primary aluminum, and by any measure, there was a massive surge. The monthly import volumes were far and away larger than they had ever been at any point in the period, even if you consider 2017. Now, what we've heard from my colleagues is that, well, when you aggregate the alloyed number in, it wasn't really much of a surge. But the agreement contemplates monitoring each category separately for surges. And that surge of the non-alloyed commodity grade product is what collapsed the US price and violated the agreement, and there had to be relief imposed. In addition, this idea that, well, China's the biggest problem and that's why we should be focusing on China. The OECD report details subsidies provided in China and in other places. And when you look at that report, what you see is you have massive subsidies provided in China, Canada, and in other India, Russia. And that subsidization causes a capacity expansion in those places. Production goes up, whereas production in those other non-subsidized countries goes down over the same period from 2013 through 2017. And then the idea that, well, we should only be addressing China seems to ignore the fact that the Chinese don't export primary aluminum principally. There are very few exports of Chinese primary. That's a globally traded commodity product. And that, because it's a globally traded commodity product, the imports, regardless of where they're from, transmit that adverse price, which encompasses the subsidies provided in all regions, not just in China. And so in order to effect meaningful relief, you have to apply the tariffs broadly and comprehensively. And then finally, there was some discussion about Russian traders, and I really find that odd, this point. So if you look at the import statistics, the volume of Russian metal coming into the United States is down substantially. And somehow there's this allegation that certain entities are benefiting. I think if we're going to start looking at the ownership structures of the different companies, if that's somehow relevant to this, what's really relevant, frankly, is whether we're creating and maintaining and sustaining U.S. primary aluminum jobs. And the answer to that question is yes. But if we're going to start looking at ownership structures, the largest producer in Canada is his largest shareholder is the largest Chinese state-owned aluminum producer. So how is that not relevant if the ownership structures of everyone else is somehow relevant? Frankly, it's not relevant. What is relevant is that we are producing primary aluminum again in the United States. We've increased production. We're sustaining and maintaining those jobs that are critical to national security. And that's what the purpose of the program was about. So now I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys want to send our way.
Well, thanks. I think I want to let's just have a little discussion. Maybe
Yeah.
I can see Tom and Jean were, I think, want to weigh in.
Well, if I may jump in, the OECD report states that Canada's industry benefited from the availability of a loan for projects. At the end of the day, most of that loan was not used. And if it had been used, it would have represented about $100 million over so many years, which does not compare at all with 70 billion US dollars in China. So saying that this was massive, it's not massive. And it's not the bottom line of the loan situation. It was a very small amount that was used at the end of the day. On the China and primary exports of primary metal, China trickles down its subsidies through semi-finished products that take over markets, our markets, everybody's markets in free market economies. And this is where it hurts. This is where the pain is. And growingly, they erode market shares of free traded metal from elsewhere in the world.
Agreed. And again, the important in unwrought primary is in the basic economics of this industry is when there's a downturn in the economy, the customers are not ordering value added products. And in our case, it's the automotive industry. So it goes to unwrought or this P1020, which is what we're discussing here for those of you who are not in the aluminum industry. And so it defaults to that. Century itself, in two of its quarterly reports, announced that it itself was having a surge in this unwrought P1020 because that's what the industry has to do. You cannot turn these smelters off. They're going to keep producing. So you don't alloy the aluminum so that later you can alloy it and make it specific to the customer. And that is, and we can share with the audience how the data, how there's this transverse where it goes when unalloyed goes up, value-added products go down, and they keep going back and forth. They're a mirror image of each other. So and any other growth is part of the growth of the industry leading up to the pandemic. So, and again, Robert, you said that all the subsidy in Canada is growing capacity. And Jean told you earlier that capacity is not increased in Canada. It's increasing, but I told you it increased significantly in China just in the last 6 months. So I think that's, I think our audience needs to hear the real issue here, and it is increased capacity in China. And that's what's distorting markets, and that's what we need to address here. And again, as you said, we need a comprehensive approach. Tariffs on Canada is not a comprehensive approach to the smelter industry, to saving and growing the smelter industry in the United States. It takes a comprehensive full trade view. We have to look at the world economy. We have to look at the aluminum industry. And again, this smelter, you keep adding smelter capacity in China, the aluminum is going to find itself. It's going to find a place. It's going to find a home. And it's going to depress world prices. Jean told you, the LME has collapsed. And that is because, again, not because Canada's adding capacity, it's because China's adding capacity. So anyway, we should get to, we don't want to tie this up. I think the question of our audience will be much more enlightening than us debating each other.
Well, it is part of it to have you debate each other, obviously, an issue of where there are strong views on either side. But I do think it would be helpful, or if we can turn to some of these questions. Ken, I think you had someone holding with a live question, and if not, I'll go to the questions.
We were going to ask Kathleen Black with Coca-Cola is on the line. I think if she's there, we were going to ask, see if she's going to turn on her microphone, maybe ask a question or turn on her camera.
And I am, now am I on?
We can hear you.
We hear you. Go ahead and ask your question.
This is kind of weird.
Go ahead and ask.
try to mute and unmute my line here.
We hear you.
Oops.
We hear you,
Okay.
Kathleen. Go ahead and ask your
Sorry.
question.
There we
Okay.
go.
Kathleen Black is with Coca-Cola company, the primary user of aluminum.
Because she had to show her visual, of course.
Hey, dude, it's what we do. Not, you know, my friends from Ford can't bring their car in, so.
Kathleen, did
Really
you?
won that hockey a product in this this participation.
We all sell Coke at the end of the day. I spend quite a bit of time. Yeah, I spend a lot of my time on aluminum tariff issues. And one of the things that all of the panelists have discussed is the fact that indeed electricity is the biggest cost that goes into making aluminum. And Mr. DeFrancesco discussed the fact that there is a comparative downstream advantage that some other places in the world have with respect to electricity. Canada has its hydropower, for instance. And Mr. Simard also raised that issue. Mr. DeFrancesco also mentioned that other downstream industries have petitioned for tariff relief for other imports. And I get that. I'm just tying together a handful of comments here. Mr. Dobbins mentioned that no rational economic player would invest in US smelting because of this electricity comparative advantage situation. Because these 232 tariffs are premised on a national security basis, I have a couple of questions. One is how usually with other tariffs, whether it's AD/CVD or whatnot, they are time limited to give the US player a chance to get back up and on its feet and invest. I don't see that really happening with the Glencore and Century facilities. That they just seem to be continuing to have all of us who are downstream users of aluminum pay these tariffs in perpetuity. That's one question. And the other is, if electricity is really the national security driver here and the differentiator in the industry, does it make more sense, rather than us downstream users being saddled with a competitive disadvantage here for our finished goods, does it make more sense on a national security ground to then have the Department of Defense or the Department of Energy directly subsidize those national security, and I'm putting that in my air quotes, those national security assets, so that that national security issue can be directly addressed?
Thank you, Kathleen. We're going to let Robert go first, but just to remind everyone, we only have about 10 minutes left. So if you can try to, I know there's a lot packed in her questions, but try to answer that. And then I'll also give Jean and Tom a moment to respond as well.
Sure. Thank you. So on the first question about investment, so it's just frankly not true. After the tariffs were imposed, Century did invest millions of dollars to upgrade its facilities in Hawesville and in Seabury. Those investments went along. They've expanded capacity. They brought back employment, and they have upgraded and are upgrading those facilities. Because of the surge of Canadian metal that came in, those investments were slowed, but not stopped, and they are continuing to upgrade those facilities. With respect to the comparative advantage that electricity offers, I think if you look at, again, the OECD report, that assumes that the electricity is being offered in an unsubsidized fashion, and that's not the case. A lot of the subsidies that are detailed in that OECD report are electricity subsidies provided both in China and in Canada and in other places. In the US, we don't, as you just pointed out, we don't really provide massive subsidies. We don't have industrial policies. Certainly, if the US has essentially had a choice to make, Are we going to follow the path of the rest of the world and just keep pumping subsidies in electricity and other forms?
Which we're paying for you. We downstream
Or-
users are paying your subsidy now.
Or do we use the tariffs to offset that unlevel playing field? And that's what the U.S. has done and has historically done. And frankly, to go to the downstream point, aluminum is a very small portion of the overall products that it's consumed in. And the tariffs themselves, we don't see have had any significant effect on downstream users. In fact, if you look at the beer can industry, while the tariffs were in place, the consumption of beer in cans, domestic beer production in cans actually went up by 4.5% while the tariffs were in place over the year earlier. And you see companies like Ball, who yesterday just announced that they're adding more capacity in Pennsylvania, they're adding capacity in Arizona, and they're expanding to meet demand. And if the tariffs were so detrimental, you could have put that facility in Canada or Mexico, and they didn't.
And Robert, I don't know if you wanted to briefly talk about national security, or I know Jean is ready to respond. So
sure. So obviously, in a national security environment, the national security is necessary. The aluminum itself is necessary for national security, and we've talked a little bit about the pandemic and the need to have that ability to produce that metal here in the U.S. And what we haven't talked about a little bit is that people have been wanting to use more frequently the Defense Production Act, where we have these sorts of national security issues and crises. And it's something that the Congress has been looking at. But the fact of the matter is, the Defense Production Act does not give the president the authority to order the Canadians to make more metal or anyone else. So this is something that there has to be a minimum amount of production left in the U.S. And that's what this program is designed to do.
all right, Jean, go to
Okay,
you.
two things very briefly on energy. We don't need to subsidize energy in Canada. We made historical choices more than 60 years ago. Those dams are amortized. We're paying above cost. It's all official. It's all public. So this is a false statement. As to subsidies, when you look at numbers, $8.4 billion worth of metal, tariffed at 10%, brings in $850 million. If I divide this by the number of jobs at Century, it's about over $500,000 a year subsidy for each job. That's all I have to say.
Okay, and Tom, turn to you. And Tom, when you're responding, if you could also just pick up on Robert's point about what's going on with the downstream users and impact on cans. I assume demand is up because of COVID, and we're all drinking more beer, and I'm drinking wine out of cans. But help me out.
Exactly. That is exactly. It's a market-driven issue, and obviously that's just one segment. There are a lot of other segments that are way down. And automotive is down, aerospace is down. So I don't see the strength in that argument. I think, again, I agree that for if we want for national security reasons to have a strong smelting capacity in this country, and I understand that argument, then we need to take more direct action to assure that that's in place. Again, other countries have done that. They've made a strategic decision that they want aluminum smelting capacity in their countries, and we have not. And they're disrupting markets, and we are trying to pretend like this activity is not happening. I think we need a multilateral approach to taking on Chinese subsidized overcapacity. I think the other thing we need to do is to stop granting 232 exclusions. If we think that these tariffs are important and we need to protect this industry, why are we granting all of these exclusions? So I'm sure there are other questions. Jean's answered it well. I think we all understand where we are in this.
We're unfortunately not going to be able to get to most of the questions, but I want to read one that came in, and then I have an idea. Want to maybe bring everyone back together again, Deanna, just so we can get everyone. on the same page, maybe on one thing. So this comes from, and I don't know her company at all. I'm just reading it. It's from Louise Ramsey Thomas, the president of the U.S. Metal Powders Company. I'm the president of Aluminum Powder Atomizer based in Pennsylvania. We buy aluminum from Canada, bring it by rail to PA. We then melt the 2,000-pound ingots into molten aluminum. From there, we atomize the molten aluminum to aluminum powder. We export some of this powder to Canada. So we're getting a tariff on the raw material aluminum coming in and potentially on the aluminum powder going out. This is almost a business question, but she's asking, what is a company in her situation supposed to do where they're maybe getting caught in the crosshairs of both countries' reactions to the tariff? Is there some advice that folks can give her, or how they're supposed to kind of cope in a situation like this? Robert, I see you nodding a little bit here.
So I think you're right. That is a sort of a business question. Obviously, Mr. Dobbins just alluded to the exclusion process, where she can attempt to request an exclusion. And we actually agree with Mr. Dobbins that we should not be granting so many exclusions. There's probably a similar process in Canada that she set up to also grant similar exclusions. I'd like to go back actually for a second just to the downstream point. And Mr. Dobbins alluded to that there were other segments. Well, in the common alloy 18-country dumping case that's before the International Trade Commission, that data also bears out what I was just saying, where from 2018 to 2019, while the 232 tariffs were in place, the domestic industry's prices and profitability all increased. So again, I think the downstream users actually benefit from the increased spread between the scrap rate and the Midwest premium when the tariffs are in place. At least the data bears it out. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Deanna, we have a couple questions that I think maybe can bring everyone together on the same page. But it's sort of looking ahead a little bit here too. We've heard a lot about China. We've heard a lot about their subsidization. We have some, one of the questions that came in talked about massive increase in Chinese production, 65 billion, no, might be, yeah, 65 billion in massive Chinese subsidies. What is the next step that should be taken? And I suspect that Century and the people you work with, Robert, and the Canadian Association, the American Association, are all on the same page on this and needing to deal with Chinese overcapacity, Chinese subsidization. Is that something? I mean, is there a place we can all work together with both the Trump if Trump administration too, or Biden, or however the politics are of this in the coming months? Maybe just kind of go around and let John go first, and then Tom, and then Robert.
I think that I brought this up in my intervention. I think that we have to first put in place a containment approach that resounds a former foreign policy of the US back in the 60s, but to ensure that all the free market economies take all the safeguard measures, anti-dumping, countervailing duties against China coming into their markets with subsidized or dumped products. So we have to be aligned on this. And at the same time, we have to use multilateral institutions such as OECD, such as the World Trade Organization, a revamped World Trade Organization, to bring China to the table and address this subsidies issue and overcapacity issue once and for all. The solution can only be worked out by a group of countries backed by national industries. It cannot be done strictly on a bilateral basis. It doesn't work.
It hasn't worked over the last number of years that we've been trying it in this country. So I agree with Jean.
Robert?
Thank you. So as I think many of you probably know, in the previous administration, we actually were instrumental in helping pursue or start a WTO challenge against China's subsidies. That action wasn't supported by a lot of other stakeholders, or some stakeholders, both here in the US and other places. Frankly, to address the overcapacity crisis, yes, you need to address China's subsidies, but frankly, you need to address everyone's subsidies. The capacity crisis alone is not just driven by China. It is a capacity crisis across the globe. There's production in countries that ought not to have as much or anywhere near the amount of production that they have. And it needs to be addressed systemically across the board. But we can't simply remove the tariffs and hope that that's going to happen. You'd be asking the US to unilaterally disarm, allow what's left of our industry to be hollowed out while we hope for some sort of negotiated solution. The tariffs need to remain in place while we simultaneously pursue that option. But we cannot take them down and hope that we come to some sort of resolution.
Well, no one's argued that at this point that we just unilaterally disarm. We, again, as Jean has said, market economies working together can have free trade among each other. I hope that we could all agree with that. And so if we have free and fair trade among market economies, and again, we keep throwing the subsidy issue out, and we know it's specious. The Chinese are doing it. The other subsidies are inconsequential. I mean, Foxconn is going to get $4.5 billion from the state of Wisconsin. I mean, what we're talking about is to build a plant. $30 billion are given out to companies to encourage them to build in states. So, I mean, there's always going to be some level of encouragement of companies and helping companies get started. Okay, but the real subsidies are China. Market economies can work together, we can have free trade, and if we do that together, we can then bring Chinese and other non-market bad actors to the table and have free and fair trade, which is beneficial to all of us. We've seen it. We reap the benefits of it. So I think we need to get to that place. We would love to have further conversations with WITA about how we go forward and have a multilateral approach to working with China and other non-market economies.
Certainly, the issue of state subsidization, state-owned economies, is one that is embedded in a lot of the discussions that we're having, industrial subsidies. These are questions that certainly the WTO needs to grapple with and is at the forefront of a lot of the reform proposals, and what it needs to do to keep itself viable going forward. We are really grateful to all of you. I know that there's you have a lot of divergent views here. We appreciate your willingness to join us today. Tom and Jean, thank you very much. Deanna, Robert, really grateful to having you here. We know there were a lot of questions that were asked. We had a lot to say. There was a lot of data to get out. We've been asked if there's some prepared remarks, if people want to give us links to those, we can put them with our event page where the video is located, as well as any slides that you wish to share. We can connect those and put them with your presentations. So thank you very much. We know there's a lot here. We're really grateful for your taking the time. You're all very busy. It's getting really busy here in DC. It seems that the August lull is over. We'll welcome you back in DC, Deanna, when you can get back from Idaho. But thank you all very much for joining us today. We hope to see you all soon at our future WITA events.
Thanks so
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Bye.